Welcome to the Sheffield Sunday As Bill Sees It meeting. This is a main share meeting, and today it is with great pleasure and much gratitude that we welcome Bruce B. from Iowa, who's come to share for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open up for general sharing or if you'd like to ask a question. Thank you, Bruce. It's wonderful to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Good day, everyone. My name is Bruce, and I am an alcoholic. By the grace of God and the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to pick up a drink since July 6, 1980, and for that I am eternally grateful. I was introduced to alcohol and alcoholism at a very early age. My grandmother had a brother, and we called him Uncle Petey. Uncle Petey was in a wheelchair. He had had his legs amputated because of diabetes as a direct result of alcoholism. But nobody really knew that then. And I can remember hearing Grandma say, make sure Uncle Petey doesn't drink. As one of my uncles was slipping him a bottle of port wine, and he'd crack the seal on that bottle and take a long draw off of it, and then wipe his mouth with his sleeve of his sweater. And he'd look at me with a toothless grin and say, shh, don't tell Grandma. And so I found out from an early age that alcohol was fun and you had to hide it. I had my first drink at 14, my first drunk at 16, and by the time I was 17, I was a full-blown alcoholic. Now, that doesn't mean that I drank every day, but when I drank to get drunk. And that's all I thought alcohol was to do to me. And it went on like that for many years. I could see the progression, but I couldn't see it then. When I went to school, I would walk past the liquor store and there'd be men standing on the street corner drinking Ripple wine out of paper bags. And I thought they were the alcoholics. So as long as I didn't drink Ripple wine, and as long as I didn't drink it out of a paper bag, I couldn't be an alcoholic. I got a full-time job and I was drinking on the job. And that was common. And one day I went to work and I didn't drink. And I got hurt. I suffered a very serious on-the-job injury. And I said to myself, see, I can't be an alcoholic because I didn't drink and I got hurt. So I was in deep denial. They took me to the hospital, and the anesthesiologist came down to the emergency room, and he says, I have to ask you a few questions. I have to gauge your tolerance to see how much anesthetic I have to give you for the operation. And he says, the first question he says was, do you drink? And I said, yes. He says, how much? I said, a 6-pack. He says, a week? I said, no, a day. And I thought a 6-pack a day was a safe answer. Doesn't everybody drink a 6-pack a day? And I said, man, if you had my life, you drink a 6-pack a day too. And I was lying to the man. I wasn't telling him everything that I was doing on top of that 6-pack. The hard liquor, the dry goods. And so subsequently, halfway through the operation, I hear the operating room nurse say, doctor, we have a problem. I was the problem. I started coming too. Whatever that anesthesiologist gave me, my tolerance was so high that I just shook it off and I started waking up. So he had to give me another jolt to put me down. But I didn't think I had a problem. And so for the next 2 years, I drank alcoholically before coming into the rooms. And that was my first step, but I didn't realize it then. I continued to drink alcoholically. I was married at the time, and my son was an infant, and my wife got a part-time night job. And this was the greatest thing for me because it got her out of the house and allowed me to do the kind of drinking I needed to do. And so when she left for work, I'd take the baby and I'd get him dressed and to go down to the local supermarket. And I'd put him in the shopping cart and I'd pretend to shop. And when the coast was clear, I'd make my way over to the beer display and I'd start drinking in the store. And then I wore a coat that I used every time I went shopping because it had a lot of pockets and they were very large. And I'd start putting the bottles of beer in the pockets of the coat and then pick the baby up out of the carriage and walk out of the store. And that's how I drank. And I did this on a regular basis. If I wasn't thinking about a drink, I was thinking about how I was going to get my next drink. And so I did a lot of shoplifting, and that was part of my character defects. So, July 4th, 1980, we were invited to a barbecue, a cookout, and, she didn't want to go. And, she said, the only reason we're going to go is so you can get drunk, and I don't want to go. And I did everything in my power to convince her that I would be good. And I promised her that I would only drink 2 beers. And I kept my promise to her. She only saw me drink 2 beers. When she was distracted or not paying attention, and I was ducking into the house where we were at, and I was rifling through the host's liquor cabinet and guzzling down as much as I could. And she couldn't understand how I got so drunk on 2 beers. And so 2 days later, I was involved in a confrontation, and I was mandated to come to AA. And so I figured I'll just do this until the smoke clears, until I get this thing off my back. So I went to my first meeting, not knowing what to expect. And it was a speaker meeting, and the gentleman was talking, and this is what I heard. He said, I'd only have 2 beers and go into a blackout. And I thought to myself, well, he's an alcoholic. He can't handle his liquor. I prided myself on the fact that I could drink bigger men under the table. So after the meeting was over, and the steps were on the wall, and I pretty much had most of the steps memorized before that first meeting was over. And then the men came up to me afterwards, and they started giving me their phone numbers, and they were telling me where they went on Wednesday nights, Thursday nights, Friday nights. And I said, oh, no, you don't understand. I have a small child at home, and I have to watch him because my wife works. But I'll come back next Tuesday. And so they gave me suggestions, and they said 90 meetings in 90 days, get a sponsor, join a group, get active. I said, yeah, that's fine. That works for you, but that's not for me. And so I kept coming to that one meeting a week. And before I left that first meeting, I wanted to get this right. So I asked the guy, I said, how long do I have to memorize these steps before you test me on them? And he laughed at me. He says, we don't test you on them. You live them. And I had absolutely no clue what he was talking about. So I did this one meeting a week for a while. Sometimes they did 2, And about 9 months later, I wasn't drinking, but the pink cloud broke, and I was miserable. And I had enough AA to know that, I shouldn't pick up a drink, but go to a meeting. And after the meeting, I talked to an old timer. And I says to him, I said, how long do I have to keep coming to these damn meetings? And he says, you come until you want to come. And I said, well, if this is all there is to sobriety, I might as well go get drunk. He says, go ahead. Nobody's keeping you here. And then he nailed me with what I like to call baseball bat sobriety. He says, you know something, Bruce? You're dry. You're not sober. You're around AA. You're not in it. And he was right. He nailed me good. And then I asked him to be my sponsor, and he says, well, are you willing to do what I suggest? I said, yes. He says, 90 meetings in 90 days. But 90 meetings in 90 days. But 90 meetings in 90 days. I said, you don't understand. My wife works night. I have to watch the baby. I can't come to a meeting every night. He says 90 meetings in 90 days. And he walked away. And I found out that where I worked, at 12 noon every day, within a 5-mile radius of my job, there was a meeting. So I could go to a meeting every day on my lunch break. Instead of going to lunch and getting drunk, I could go to a meeting. And that's what I did. And slowly things started to change. I mentioned that accident that I had. And I was in a meeting one night, and the topic was the yets. And I thought, well, I never got a DWI yet. I never was arrested for my alcoholism yet. And I always thought I was never hospitalized because I didn't go to a rehab. But it occurred to me that the one morning that I didn't drink and I got hurt, there was a reason. And the reason was that I was going to a party that night, and oh, how drunk I was going to get. And I knew that if I had started drinking during the day like I normally did, I wouldn't have been in any shape to make it to that party. And it occurred to me that, wow, I am powerless over alcohol. Alcohol controlled me at that time. And my life was unmanageable. And that first meeting that I went to where the man said he only drank 2 beers, well, I had heard him speak other times, and he put it into a different context when he said he didn't know where he was going to end up when he started drinking. Sometimes he could drink a case, or other times he could drink only 2 beers and go into a blackout. And I was like, wow, that puts it in a whole different perspective. So my ears started to open up and I started to listen. And things started to change. The second step came to me one day when I went to the beach and I was looking at the ocean and I thought, well, that ocean is more powerful than me. But there's something that created that ocean that's more powerful than that. So I came to believe in a power greater than myself. The third step, my sponsor said to me, Bruce, you turned your alcohol problem over to the care of Alcoholics Anonymous in step 1, and your life got pretty good. He said, what do you think would happen if you turned your whole will and your whole life over to his care? And so, I have to do that on a daily basis. I have to give it to God. When I don't, my life is not as smooth as when I do. I had a lot of trouble looking at the fourth step because I grew up in a home where it was said, you don't air your dirty laundry in public. And what's said at this table stays at this table. And so it was quite difficult for me to put down a fourth step. And I didn't even want to do a fifth step because I was going to take those secrets to the grave. And I'd go to the meeting and the old timers would be sitting in the back room playing cards before the meeting started, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes. And I'd walk in and get my cup of coffee and I'd hear one of the old timers say, hey, Bruce, how you doing with that fourth step? And I'd grit my teeth and roll my eyes and say, oh, I'm almost done. And I hear somebody say, oh, he's so full of shit. And that was true. So, I had to get honest with myself. So when I did the fifth step with my sponsor, and when we were finished, he shook my hand and he said, welcome to AA. And he says, now go home and get the big book out and turn to page 75 and read 75 and 76. And it's about taking some time and reflecting on the fifth step and then talking about step 6 and step 7. So I went home and I did that and I opened the book and I read and I did the 7-step prayer and I thought to myself, oh my, how easy was that? I just did 5, 6, and 7 in one afternoon. If I knew it was going to be that easy, I would have done it sooner. And so he had said to me later on that evening, meet me at the meeting and we'll talk about it. So I figured he's going to put me on step 8. So I got ready for the meeting that night. I got in my car and I took off and I realized that I needed a pack of cigarettes. So I went to the supermarket and I stole a pack of cigarettes and I went to the meeting. And I don't know when it occurred to me, but I heard a woman say, you can take the drink away from a drunken horse thief, but you'll still have a horse thief. And that was me. And when it says in chapter 5, those who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves, they are such unfortunates. They're not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. And man, that hit me like a ton of bricks. That was me. I was unconstitutionally incapable of being honest with myself. So I had to get honest with myself. And I had to keep my hands in my pockets, instead of thinking that everything that was on the shelf belonged to me. So I had to really take a deep look at my personal character defects. The 7th step came to me one morning when I went to get a haircut. And I walked into a barber shop. There was 3 barbers on duty. And 2 of them had customers, and the third barber was sitting in his chair reading his newspaper. When he saw me, he waved me over, and I sat down. He started cutting my hair. And there was 2 other gentlemen getting haircuts, and one of them was a Hasidic Jew, an Orthodox Jewish man. And when he got done with getting his hair cut, he got up and he paid the barber, and he went over to the sink and he washed his hands, and he left. And my barber thought that was hilarious. And he says to the other barber, he says, hey, Danny, you do all the work and that effing Jew's got to wash his hands. And everybody laughed. It was funny. But he wouldn't let it go. He just kept ragging on and on and on. And finally, after some time, the other gentleman was finished with his haircut. He got up out of his chair and he starts walking over to my barber. And he puts his finger in my barber's face as he's putting his yarmulke on top of his head. And he says, it is Jewish law that when a Gentile touches a Jew, the Jew must wash his hands. Well, my barber got caught. He felt that big. He got busted. He opened up his big mouth and somebody shut it up for him. And that was humiliating. And the lesson that I learned was the humility is to let anybody go about their business without any interference from me. When I did the 8th step, it says make a list of all people we had harmed. It doesn't say make a list of all the people we harmed when we were drinking. The book says go back as far as memory will allow. And I did something when I was 7 years old to a family that lived across the street. And what happened was I realized that I did something wrong when the two mothers, my mother and this family's mother, got together in our backyard, and they were both crying. And I wasn't raised that way, but what I did hurt this family. And so when I was making out my list, this bothered me, and I had to put them on the list. And I went to make my amends to this family, and I explained what had happened. And it was so long ago, they didn't remember it, but I remembered it. And I made my amends. And as I was leaving, and the husband of the family, the father, walked me out to my car, and he says, just be a good man. And I said I would. And so when I did the rest of my 9th step with other people, it ran the gamut from, oh, you weren't that bad, to why don't you go F yourself? And there was a woman there that I had really berated verbally many times. And she said to me, don't tell me you're sober. Show me. Because I couldn't badmouth her either behind her back or in front of her face and still say, oh, I'm in Alcoholics Anonymous. It doesn't work that way. I have to put this life into action. And in the 10th step, they say I like to call it the golden rule step. Am I doing to others the way I'd like to be treated? And it's not the I'm sorry step, because I used to say I'm sorry every time I drank. But it's a matter of changing. And, if you want to know how I'm doing in sobriety, ask my wife, because she's the one that I have to live with, and she lives with me. And am I walking the walk, or am I just talking the talk? And, I don't always get it right. It says when we are wrong, not if. And the 11th step is such a beautiful step. We sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. We already have a conscious contact with God early on, as early as the 2nd step. But now we're trying to improve it. And if you do spiritual things happen. And there's so much material out there to read on spirituality and channeling and helping us grow in the spirit. And it came to me one day when I was reading the book Pass It On, Bill Wilson's autobiography. And on page 198, he says that he wasn't feeling well that night, and he was going to write chapter 5. And he says he put the pillow up against the headboard of the bed, and he put the pad up against his knees. And before he started to write, he asked for some spiritual guidance. And it was as if the words just seemed to flow out onto the page. And it was the first time that he had put the steps down in written form. And when he went back and counted them, realizing he had 12, it filled him with a wonder and serenity that he had never felt before. And he says in the book, it reminded him of the 12 apostles. Now, this is not a religious program, and I'm not a Bible thumper, but this is what it speaks to me spiritually. And this is the part where I say, take what you like and leave the rest. They were just 12 ordinary men and women who came to their teacher on a daily basis to learn about a new way of life. A life that was filled with patience, tolerance, understanding, compassion, humility, forgiveness, honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And as they put that way of life into their lives, then they were asked to go out into the world to carry a message and bring others closer to God. And doesn't that sound like our program? When we put the 12 steps into our lives to the best of our ability, we begin to understand the meaning of those same principles, and we begin to live them also. And we bring others closer to God. I came into AA to learn how not to drink, and every meeting I go to, we end up talking about God. And it's such a wonderful thing. And Bill used that spiritual number 12 as a tribute to God, because he felt that if he did that, maybe God would show favor on this fledgling band of alcoholics. And God has been so good to us. We are the chosen ones now. And each and every one of us has the opportunity to serve God as we serve each other. And all of us have the ability to love God as we love one another. And you know, you never know who you're going to help when you go to a meeting. Just by showing up and helping somebody else, giving them the encouragement, the hope that we've received, can mean the difference between life and death. And I went to a meeting. Mary and I went back to the East Coast several years ago to visit family and friends, and we went to a meeting one night, and it happened to be anniversary night. And it was a gentleman that was celebrating his anniversary that I remembered when he first came in. And after the meeting was over, he came up to me and he says, Bruce, I just want to say thank you. And I said, for what? He said, something you said 14 years ago helped me stay sober. And I said to him, what did I say? If it was so good, I'd like to know what I said, so maybe I could say it again to somebody. But he didn't remember what it was, and I didn't remember what I said. But it was just something in that moment that touched his heart, that convinced him that, you know, maybe I shouldn't go out and drink. And he stayed, and he celebrated 14 years. And he became a good and useful member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I went to a meeting. I had the commitment one night to do an outspeak in a meeting about an hour away from where I lived. And I had never been to this meeting before. And so I went and I introduced myself to the chairperson. And he says, well, this is a step meeting, and we read out of the 12 and 12, and then you share for about 10, 15 minutes on the step, and then we go around the room with a show of hands. I said, okay. He says, we're on step 9. I said, fine. So we read, I shared, and we went around the room, and about halfway through the meeting, this old codger, he kind of raises his hand, and he says, my name's Huey, and I'm an alcoholic. And everybody said, Huey, and they were laughing, and I knew this guy was some kind of a character. He starts telling a story about when he was a kid. He stole a car. He was drunk, stole a car, and he was joyriding around town. And the sheriff knew it wasn't his car, so the cop gave chase. And he couldn't outrun the cop, so he abandoned the car and he started running through the woods. And he said, I could hear the sheriff's bullets whizzing past my ears. So now years later, he gets sober. He's in the program, and he says, I'm sitting at the counter of the Yankee Clipper Diner in Beacon, New York. And in walks this cop who's now retired, and he sits down next to me. And I thanked him for not shooting me in the head. And he says, Huey, you were a pain in my ass. And that's how I did the 9th step. And everybody laughed. Well, it kind of piqued my curiosity because my sponsor grew up in the same town, Beacon, New York. So after the meeting was over, I went up to this man and I said, excuse me. I said, can you tell me the name of the cop? He says, Billy West. Why? I says, well, because my sponsor grew up in Beacon and he had a little run-in with the law in his youth, and I'd like to know if he knew the cop. So he looks at me and goes, who's your sponsor? I says, Vinny DeCastro. Do you know him? He says, I'm his Uncle Huey. Well, the thing about that was I knew Vinny very well. You know, he was my sponsor. We even worked together. We had many social engagements with our families. And not one time did Vinny ever say to me, I've got an uncle in the program. And so when I says to this guy, I says, well, when I go home tonight, I'm going to call him. And do you mind if I tell him that I met you? He says, no, go ahead. So I went home, I called Vinny, and I says, Vinny, I got a message for you. He says, what is it? I says, your Uncle Huey says hello. And there was a pause. And he said, who? I said, your Uncle Huey. And he got quiet again. He said, he's dead. I said, well, that might be the case, but this old codger's alive and well and living up in Goshen, New York. And he was like, holy mackerel. And you know, when you take the phone away from the landline and you talk to somebody else in the room, and I hear him say to his wife, hey, Mars, Baker found Huey. And I hear her say, I thought he was dead. Well, that was the case. What had happened was, one day Huey was sitting in the bar drinking, and a guy sitting next to him says, you want to go to California? And he says, okay. And they got up and they got in the guy's car and they took off. And they made it as far as Cleveland when the car broke down, and they were never heard from again. And after 7 years, the family just wrote this guy off as dead. And he was dead to them until I went to the meeting and I found him. Now, if that's not a God thing, I don't know what it is. And I got the two men together, Vinny and Huey together, and Huey had to do a real ninth step, not only to Vinny, but to the entire family for abandoning them and never coming back and never letting them know what had happened. So God uses me, God uses all of us to do wonderful things for his plan. Huey finally did make amends to that family, and his oldest daughter was terminally ill with cancer. And so he had to make amends to that young lady. And when he walked into her hospital room, she exploded with joy and said, "My father came back to me." Now that's a God thing as far as I'm concerned. And these things still happen to us every day. That's why I still keep coming to meetings. The reason is because, last month, Mary and I, we went to an anniversary meeting, and it was an eating meeting. And after the dinner was over, I walked up to a guy that I had met a few months prior to this, and we got to talking, a younger man, and I says, "Mike, how you doing?" He says, "Not too good." He says, "I can't find a job. I'm unemployed, and I don't drive, so it's hard for me to get work." So I said to him, "Why don't we just pray?" And we got together and we put our heads down and we held hands, and I just said simply, "God, Mike's a good guy. He needs a break. Please find him a job. In your name we pray." Well, that was a Saturday. About a month later, last week, Mary and I went to a meeting, and Mike was there. And when he saw me, he came running up to me and he gave me a big hug. He says, "I got a job." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I got the job the Monday after we prayed." I said, "That was wonderful." I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm a custodian in a hospital right down the street from where I live, so I can just walk to my job." He says, "And I love it because I love to clean." I said, "Well, that's wonderful. I didn't know it was going to happen so soon, but God knew." And each and every one of us has the opportunity to serve God and to do his plans. And that's why I keep coming back, because this is a wonderful program. I not only don't drink one day at a time, we get to do service. And Mary and I, we members of our local church, and about 7 years ago, they needed a pastor. And our church sent us to lay ministry school, a 3-year course. And when we graduated, we were certified as lay ministers. And we needed a pastor, and our church turned around and said to the district superintendent, "We want Bruce and Mary to lead our church." So now we're pastors in our church, and it's one of the most wonderful opportunities that we can do, not only to serve God, but to serve our community. And these things happen only because of the fact that I don't drink and go to meetings. And Alcoholics Anonymous has done this for me. It's saved my life, and it's saved the life of so many people. And we are the ones that build this edifice, this structure, this spire up to God, one day at a time. And thanks for letting me share. God bless you all, and God bless Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'll pass.